What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Simulation at the Women in Technology Summit. We are sitting down with Josh Mantz now.
How you doing?
Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here with so many women that are building the future and that are so inspirational. And you yourself are also very inspirational. So let's sit down and talk about what you've went through, who you are, and what you're building into the world. So Darker Souls.
You got it.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about Darker Souls and how it came to be in your past as well. Give us a little bit of a backstory and where you are now.
Yeah. So basically, everything that I do now revolves around the field of psychological trauma and helping people overcome adverse experiences. You know, it's still a very stigmatized field. Trauma is widely misunderstood and oversimplified. And my goal is to help people uncover the truth behind trauma. Right, to help them look at their experiences through a completely different lens, to integrate them into their lives and then become stronger because of it. So that journey started really about 10 years ago when I was shot and killed by an enemy sniper in Baghdad while I was serving in the military. And the bullet actually severed my femoral artery, and I died for 15 minutes before being revived. And the journey afterwards, everything since then has kind of led to the work that's being done now, and it's I consider a privilege to do it.
Where does one even start with that? Well, first is thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for your service. And holy crap, getting sniped! Wow, just can't even understand what that feeling's like.
You know, so here's the thing. Well, one, there's a lot of strange things that happened that day, right? To put this into perspective, right? The typical standard where a physician would typically call it on a patient who flatlines is around the 6-minute mark. And something prompted that medical team to continue working on me for 15 straight minutes. Right? They administered over 30 units of blood. We were at a very rogue care facility, minimal equipment. I mean, the defibrillator paddles that they used to shock me back to life literally came into the base that morning, and they had to take them out of the plastic to use them on me. And bottom line is, if I woke up at all, they expected catastrophic brain damage. Woke up with no trace of brain damage, full recollection of the events, up until the point I took my very last breath, and was fortunate to make a full recovery. So the only way that I can describe the experience of dying, right? And there was kind of a progression, because from the point I was shot to the point I took my last breath was about 30 minutes or so. And, there's a lot of very bizarre physiological symptoms that occurred, over that 30 minutes. But I think the most important part is in those final moments, right? When you're dying of blood loss, you're essentially suffocating, right? And the body will attempt to pull the remaining blood it has into the chest cavity, right, to protect the vital organs. And I could literally feel this happening, right? So the blood would creep out of my extremities, and as all the blood would leave, they'd cramp up and become numb. And then that blood creeping to move up through my thighs, and they became numb. And when that feeling hit my stomach, it was the first point where I realized the injury was getting out of control.
Yeah.
And it felt like I was running wind sprints around a track. Couldn't stop. Right. It was like an anaerobic pain. And emotionally, life didn't flash before my eyes like we sometimes hear about. But I do believe that what was most important to me was revealed in those final moments. And just instinctively, I started to repeat 3 names in my mind over and over again for the last minute of my life. And that was my mom and my 2 sisters. But when that feeling hit my chest, I consciously knew that was it, took my last breath, and died.
Whoa.
And the question we get a lot is, did you see the white light? Did you have like an out-of-body experience? And the answer to that is no. Not in the way we might traditionally think about it. But what I did experience, I think, was maybe even more profound because I know I was still conscious for it. And what I'm referring to here is literally the precise point in time from the transition from life to death, like as I was taking the last breath. And the only way that I can describe that feeling is one of absolute surrender to something much greater than ourselves, right? And through that surrender was just an overwhelming sense of peace. Yeah. Like, it feels like the spirit becomes part of everything and nothing at the same time. So total peak experience. Whoa. Right there. Right.
Most people don't get to feel that twice in a lifetime.
They don't, so this is interesting, when we look at what we call peak experiences, right? Certainly a near-death thing can invoke that. Certain psychedelic experiences can invoke this. Rites of passage, traumatic experiences, certain dreams, right, can be profound enough to kind of dislodge us from our past constructs and open the door to a new level of awareness, right? And what was interesting about this is when that happened to me 10 years ago, I didn't know what to do with it, right? And sometimes the biggest challenges we have with adverse experiences or trauma is if we're unable to derive meaning in them, and if we're unable to integrate the experience into our lives in the present moment, it's almost like we're trying to fit what's happening now into the model of the past, right? And sometimes those things don't line up, and it can cause a lot of adversity and confusion into our lives. So it's partially what I do is help people look at their experiences through a slightly different lens, and give them permission to integrate it in a different way.
On darkersouls.com, which we have in the bio, you write from trauma to transformation.
Right.
And before we get into that, we have to stay here on the story a little bit longer because it's just nuts and it's important to unpack. Mm-hmm. So as this bullet lands through your femoral artery and the blood is slowly leaving the extremities and the parts of the body are becoming numb, and then you're noticing I'm losing too much blood because it's now starting to creep up into my lower body, into up here towards like your gut. Then that moment came of thinking about mom and two sisters and repeating their names and those moments with them. That feeling crept in, and that's kind of like the feeling of the people that might have been most important to you in your life, and then the last sort of breath, and then that was a feeling of just not being there anymore, and then waking up after the medical team had operated on you.
Yeah, I describe that final moment as a feeling of absolute pure awareness, right? Some of, regardless of what your, spirituality or religious faith is, some may refer to it as like feeling the presence of God, right? Or pure absolute awareness. It was a gift to experience that, right? What I find is that it took 10 years to almost come full circle with that experience, and found that the challenge, the beauty of that journey was to learn how to revisit that moment and do it consciously, right? Yeah. And instead of being forced into it. And that really requires like surrendering, right? To much, what is surrender? I look at surrender as not being attached to the outcome, right? To continue to fiercely pursue that which we're passionate about, but do we have the strength to respond and when the outcome is not as we intended it to be or expected it to be, right? That we're riding this wave of life, we're going through this journey. But 10 years ago, I didn't have that perspective, right? And woke up about 2 days later after this injury in the green zone to learn that I had died for that long.
It took 2 days?
Yeah, about 2 days. And then, I was evacuated back to the United States to recover. And, I was fortunate. I snapped back from this injury pretty quick, physically at least, and was back in Baghdad 4 months later.
You went?
Yeah, about 4.5 months later.
You went back?
Yeah, I volunteered to go back. And now it's...
You are truly nuts.
Well,
wow.
There's this when you're part of a team, especially being in a leadership role, right? Knowing that my team was still in a great deal of danger.
Yes.
Everybody we were serving, and I mean, not just the Americans, the Iraqis, everybody we worked with, there's a profound sense of guilt, regardless of how irrational that may sound, right?
I hear what you're saying.
But there's guilt of not being part of that main effort.
That effort anymore. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
But this is an important part of where kind of these emotional seeds started to be planted, right? Because guilt and shame are two of the most complex and destructive emotions that we have, right?
Mm-hmm. And fear is up there too.
Yep. Now there's advantages to those, right? There's reasons for all emotions across the spectrum, right? But when the levels of shame and guilt become toxic, that's when it can really turn on ourselves. And that's what was almost beginning to happen almost as soon as this injury occurred, right? Like, for example, I look at guilt as almost a form of cancer, right? That in the beginning, it infects the deepest corners of our soul, and we're at stage 1.
Yeah.
And we don't even know it's there. Yet it starts to control our lives in ways that we don't even understand. And as we continue to suppress our past experiences and try to ignore them and compartmentalize them, the more we continue to do that, the more it can take control over our lives, right? And before we know it, we might be at stage 4 and in crisis and not understanding why. As a specific example of what I'm talking about and the complexity of guilt, when I was recovering in the hospital, I was evacuated to a place called Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which is the biggest hospital in the military. And it's where all the most severely wounded service members are evacuated to recover. And, medically, physically, the best care in the world. There's nowhere else I would rather be than that hospital. But emotionally, it's a very difficult place to be. You're surrounded by the worst of the worst injuries, amputees, burn victims. You're seeing the impact that has on their families. And even, as bad as my injury was, I was one of the only ones in that hospital that was expected to make a full recovery. Mm-hmm. Right? So, one of the images that I'll always remember is walking around a corner, seeing this beautiful young girl in her early 20s pushing around her new double amputee fiance in a wheelchair. And, that's an image that just riveted me. Mm. So the guilt that I was starting to experience was a guilt in my ability to heal when other people couldn't, right? Coupled with not being downrange with the team. And that kind of propelled me to do this thing, irrationally so. I was pulling staples out of my leg with a Leatherman. I was throwing out my medical records and lying to do whatever I needed to do to get back to that team. Yeah. And there's a positive resiliency aspect to that. There's a lot of positives, but there's a much more destructive side that wouldn't begin to surface until years later, right?
The photo imprinted in my mind of what that medical center looks like with all of the people that have sacrificed their health and well-being for serving the country. Mm. That's crazy. It's crazy. And I think I think a lot of people listening would like to voice their discomfort with the amount of war that the United States gets involved in and sacrifices people in that sense. But at the same time, it's really important to remember that the United States makes decisions like that to remain a geopolitical leader. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to find that balance. Mm-hmm. And then also just that image, of, the woman in her young 20s with the man that had both his legs amputated. Like that's crazy. It's crazy, and it's crazy for the family members as well. And that moment for you of, well, let's get to the trauma to transformation, but and how exactly it went for you and how now you're helping others. Just this like moment of, to me, I bet, and this is a bet, but I bet that what you felt when you went into death was somewhat similar to what we experience when we go really deep into ego loss with psychedelics, or when we go really deep into meditation for a week or more at a time straight. That there's just some really profound things that happen to of consciousness when it dies.
Right.
And I think that area very much so interests me. I think it can provide a lot more equanimity, a lot more collaboration across the planet, a lot more love, humanity, and do you think that that's right in that same ballpark-ish?
No, I do. It's interesting to see all the research that's starting to come out on psychedelics today. And I actually study consciousness. I'm in a master's program in San Francisco right now, taking a look at a lot of these things. And like we're saying, like the peak experiences, regardless of how they're derived, can have similar effects on our ability to transcend to a new, higher level of consciousness, right? To gain a drastically new perspective on life, as long as we're able to integrate the experience.
Integration,
right? And that's where the challenge is, right? It's a lot of folks. Some folks can run into the mistake of, kind of what's called spiritual materialism, where you're constantly chasing the next spiritual high of psychedelic use without integrating the prior one.
Yes.
Right? So what's interesting though is the organizations that kind of seem to do this the right way they almost treat it ritualistically. Like they respect the process. There's an approach. There's a lot of times therapy leading up to it to kind of prep for the experience, and then there's a network of support surrounding the person to help them integrate it afterwards.
Yeah. Psychotherapy.
Yep, exactly, right? But it can be absolutely profound.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of parallels. Like when you look at some of the similarities come out of like Dr. Rick Strassman's work on DMT. One of the common things that people describe is this feeling of being part of everything and nothing.
Yes.
And that is precisely
what you felt.
What I felt.
Yeah.
Like indescribably so, right?
Part of everything and part of nothing.
Yep. Yeah. And a lot of people it's hard to conceptualize this, right? But because it's not as if just the bad stuff falls away, right?
We're
the good and the bad.
You fall into the sea of atoms.
Yep.
And you are no longer what the brain is doing and what you are inside of what you're perceiving through your eyes. Everything is a sea of atoms, and you become that, and then there's a feeling of nothingness as well associated with that, because then there is no what you are. The thing is the consciousness, and the nothingness is the no consciousness.
Right.
And it's very difficult to explain. It's much easier to experience, and we don't necessarily need extremely high doses of psychedelics in order to be able to start getting to the edge. The edge comes actually quite quickly with psychedelics. You start getting to the edge more and more slowly over time, and like you said, integration, psychotherapy are so crucial. Okay, let's unpack trauma to transformation. So both for you and for now, facilitating others. Tell us about this.
So, let me just share kind of what happened, right? Is if we took what happened to me on the surface, this idea of getting shot, dying, coming back to life, going back to Baghdad 4 months later, right? On the surface, if we stop there, that would make a pretty cool story, right? It'd look kind of like this mini hero's journey in some ways. It would
a blockbuster movie.
Yeah, like it's this like archetypal warrior thing,
totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And what happened though is, 2009, the Department of Defense at the time, and I was still in the military for years after this, but they were starting to become very serious about psychological health. Suicide rates are spiking.
Yeah.
Depression, the whole range of the consequences of combat were starting to surface. And stigma was a huge problem back then, right? And now, today I'll tell you that there's a stigma around the word stigma, right? And when you get to, it's very complex. But rightfully so, back then, the main primary initial stigma was this fear of being branded as weak and the fear of losing your career, if you sought help in the behavioral health field.
Yes.
So as an officer, as a leader, I was able to get on stage, entered into the speaking circuit back then to reduce and eliminate stigma, right? And
hell yes.
so I was on the speaking circuit less than 2 years after this injury, long before I even started to understand what was happening. And what was interesting though, in the span of 2 years, I did over 200 talks, on top of all the other jobs I was doing. CNN, Fox, Oprah, BBC, I was briefing at the biggest behavioral health conferences in the world. I had a near clinical understanding of this topic of post-traumatic stress. And yet I still failed to recognize the symptoms, the deeper symptoms within myself.
Yeah. I'm so interested to know about these.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where I found myself in the first of many suicidal spirals to come. And here it is, I'm just coming off of CNN, right? And then suddenly standing in a corner of a hotel room, not having a clue who I was anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Gosh, and that's kind of like the Bourdain and Spade a little bit. It's very, very highs, and then how can I still, and even Kanye West and stuff, it's just you're so high, and Kid Cudi and all these it's just nuts what the climb up can do as you get off of a very big high, and then you get off that high and you're just what's the question, like you said earlier, is you can get stuck in wanting what's higher and also not knowing yourself and going into lows, and lows can sometimes hold people in the lows. They can get trapped in the lows. This is a very complex thing, and you were able to figure out only after you spoke. You even had a clinical understanding of it, and this is also very interesting. If people can have a clinical understanding of trauma, PTSD, they have a clinical understanding, but the experiential wisdom, the feeling, the energy, how it affects other people, what those complex interrelationships are within yourself and others. How did you end up uncovering what the real rawness was?
And that was that first spiral was the point where I realized that whatever I was doing, I was missing something that was much deeper, right? And what's emerged is, again, there's an oversimplification of what trauma is and how we respond to it. And many people think, or, just because of culture, media, kind of how it's been portrayed, is that post-traumatic stress, or what I call, living in the post-trauma state, how we respond to adversity, right?
Yeah.
There's kind of a spectrum of what could happen, how we respond to that. But many people kind of think that it's related to what we call hyper-arousal symptoms. It's anxiety, nightmares, night sweats, being jumpy at loud noises, kind of the proverbial things that we hear about when we hear this term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And those types of responses are very valid, right? They're true in the lives of many people. Yeah. But it's only one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is called hypoarousal, right? And that's much less discussed. It's much less, because maybe it's harder to quantify in some ways. Emotional withdrawal, feeling emotionally dead, right? Being crippled by the effects of shame and powerlessness and betrayal and guilt, these moral, ethical, spiritual wounds, right? And one thing that we see a lot is our inability to form loving relationships with somebody else, feeling emotionally numb and dead and withdrawn and isolated. That isolation is deadly, yes. Right? And that's unfortunately what we can see in so many different places, right? And because it's hard to understand what guilt is, right? What shame is, that emotional void that we can experience at that rock bottom low, right? And by bringing truth to what that is and normalizing it for people, validating it for people, the hope is that it can plant the seed that might give that spark of hope at the right moment to take that next step. There's so much power in the power of human connection and the relationships that we share between one another.
Yes.
Right?
You have to break this down. We have to unpack it just a little bit more before we move on. What was the word? Hyper
arousal.
Arousal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hyper, hypo.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So hyper arousal and hypo arousal. I haven't heard it quantified this way before. I kind of like it quantified into different areas because I think that's really important. It finally makes it a little bit more clear, kind of what triggers people. So hyper arousal, things like the trauma. And then hypoarousal is things like seeing yourself in a position that is not recognized by your community. That I don't have someone that I love that doesn't love me. So that kind of breakdown of those two things into different areas is, I wonder what actually ends up affecting people the most, and are the solutions different for each? Probably. What are the solutions for each that are really strong? Right now we see organizations like MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, on phase 3 of clinical trials for MDMA, for PTSD. So there's like this very interesting solution, or maybe the solution for the hypo arousal is that we need a stronger social fabric, more love, more community. So so that was just very interesting. I just wanted to
Well, and it gets our experiences, they're all relative, right? And there's often a mix of how we respond in the post-trauma state, right? There's many different ways to approach it, right? Depending on the person, depending on the situation, that could range from things like cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, EMDR, neurological techniques, right? There's a lot of different therapeutic modalities out there that can address different aspects of this. What I'm primarily focused on with what I do is bringing more awareness to the generality of the topic, right? This does not, trauma doesn't discriminate.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a good way to put it.
It impacts all of us from every walk of life, right? And even though the nature of our experiences could be completely different, the emotions that manifest from them can be very similar, right? And when we talk about the power of human connection, some think that, because I was in the military, the only people that could understand me were military folks, right? Or if I'm an engineer, the only people that could understand me are engineers, right? And I found that the opposite to be true, right? Sometimes I found people who could connect with me in places where I least expected it. From every background, black, white, men, women, gay, straight, engineers, social workers, doctors, attorneys, right? The difference is they were all people, right, who at some point in their lives, in their own ways, were exposed to the darker side of human nature.
The darker soul.
Yeah, the darker soul. They had the strength to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right? And that vulnerability can bind us together at the very core of the human experience if we allow it. So here's the thing.
We have to allow it.
We have to allow it, right? It takes, these are very uncomfortable conversations to bring up, right? What we experience in the post-trauma state can leave us feeling isolated and defective as human beings, right? Like we don't fit in. If we cannot feel emotion, right? If we feel so numb, right? If I'm in a state of chronic abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse, police officers on the street getting exposed to chronic trauma for 30 years career, military, it doesn't discriminate, right? But when we're repeatedly exposed to these situations,
Vulnerability.
Yep, it can really cause us to kind of learn out of survival to shut down our emotions, and when we kind of get back to what we might consider a normal situation, it can feel like we don't fit in, right? To the point of like deadly levels of isolation.
Yeah.
You know, so the key is to normalize those feelings of isolation, validate them. You know, give people permission to look at their pain, validate the source of their pain so that they can begin to recover from it. Yep.
Normalize holding space for people to just be with their feelings.
Right.
And normalize vulnerability, especially for men.
Yep.
And that's why we're here as male allies at WITI.
Yep.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, right? Like in the past, like I'm a strong believer that in the post-trauma state, we it's important to retain the humility that in some cases the people who are close to us in our lives may know more about us than we do in the present moment. There were many times that I can look back on retrospectively where people would pick up on certain behaviors or certain kind of warning signs, and they bring them to my attention. And even though I was completely unaware of it, even though I didn't even maybe necessarily agree, I retained the humility to at least listen, to take in what they were saying. Right? So that person had to have the courage to approach and have that uncomfortable conversation. I had the courage to listen. Right? It was a two-way street. And the point is, it allowed healing seeds to be planted in the mind that when I did hit that rock bottom spiral, there was that little thread of hope. Right? And that's the thing. Suicide is a condition of hopelessness. You know? And when we can create hope in the lives of people through conversations like this, that's what we hope. We'll continue to propagate this whole effort.
Yeah, a feeling of hopefulness, a feeling of there's a good song that Kanye and Kid Cudi just pushed out called "Reborn." I'm so reborn. I'm moving forward. Keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. And so that feeling of continuing to move forward, and also holding the space for people to just be with those feelings, and just knowing that there is hope. And how can we create more hope and not hopelessness, because that is what triggers. But we have good friends within the Circling Institute, and they hold space for people. We've been within their space quite a bit, and holding that space for people to just be with their feelings is extraordinary. It's confidential, it's extraordinary. We're not coaching people, we're just being with their feelings.
Yep.
And we're paraphrasing, we're actively listening and paraphrasing and validating, and they feel like, wow, this person gets me. Like that's great, that great feeling. And then at some point it is also beneficial to coach as well, because then the feeling of once you are validated, once your feelings are validated, that they're heard, then the ability to move forward from that to something greater than to actualize past those feelings to what keep moving forward. What is that? The value, the utility that you want to bring to the world for other people to feel like you are part of the community, that you are contributing, and that they're contributing to you and whatnot. So, yeah.
That's the beauty of a darker soul.
Tell us,
there's a world-renowned psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor named Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he says that without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. And that the suffering we endure gives us ample opportunity to derive greater meaning in our lives. So suffering is a universal process. As isolated as it can make us feel, right? As detached as it can make us feel, it is a universal phenomenon. Transformation is up to each one of us, right? It's an internal process, but it's not a process that we need to take alone. So when we can learn to derive meaning in our experience, when we can grow from them, transcend through them, and then be able to apply it to the lives of other people, right? That is the beauty of walking through the darkness, right? It's one of the most fascinating things that I've been looking into recently, thanks to one of my professors, a brilliant mathematical cosmologist named Brian Swim in San Francisco.
You gotta hook us up with these smart people, bro.
Yeah, it's amazing. So Brian looks at he goes back to the very inception of the universe, right? What he calls, instead of the Big Bang, the primordial flaring forth, right? At which time that even if we were able to observe it, right, which we couldn't because we're all part of it, right? Even if we were able to observe it in the beginning, it wouldn't even look like anything. It would just be this shimmering for the first billion years, right? And seriously, something caused these gases to form. Something caused them to start to gravitate together, right? And what happens is, as a star is formed, right? Initially, it's just gases being pulled together, hydrogen, helium. And as those gases pull together, the force of gravity continues to push it closer and closer and closer. Now, what the gravity wants to do is continue to push it so close together that it implodes. And if it imploded, there would be no star and there would be no us, right? So we're all part of that same system. Instead, what does the star do in order to survive? It self-combusts, right? It literally sacrifices parts of itself, setting itself on fire in order to fight back the pressure of the gravity, right? And the point here is that as we look through the evolution of the cosmos, right, all the way up to life, to the present day, that it's a process of suffering and self-sacrifice, right, and pain and destruction to produce things that are more beautiful, more grand, more complex, right? So even when we don't understand the nature of our traumatic experiences, the sense of isolation that is inherent to it, sometimes to not feel alone, all we need to do is look around us, look up, connect with other people, because the process is everywhere.
It's
right?
Interesting that it can be related to the cosmos, to the formation of stars.
Right.
That is very interesting. And it has made me slightly reconsider what I was going to say earlier, but I still want to say it to just hear your thoughts about it. I think that it's very much so possible that suffering is extremely valuable and universal. And like you said, suffering universal, transformation requires hope. It requires so many other community. It requires tons of other things, and then we get through that with our transformation, the suffering. But I am not sold on suffering being universal. I'm not sold on utopic civilizations having suffering. I do think that it's quite possible, a couple millennia down the line, maybe even just a couple hundred years down the line, if we can figure out how to work together. Once everyone's basic needs are met, if me having items doesn't preclude you from having items, that we've really traveled the stars, that we know how to do these things and we're doing it quite well, and that nobody's killing each other and all this kind of cool stuff, I don't think anyone's going to suffer. And whether maybe digital consciousness, maybe you don't suffer with digital consciousness either. So I don't necessarily think that one needs to suffer in order to feel happiness and stuff like that. So it's complex, it's difficult, but that would be my slight challenge to that thought, just to see what you have to say.
Well, let's look at what trauma is, right? What is suffering? A traumatic experience is a situation or event that fundamentally disrupts the way we believe the world should work, right? And it's not always what it seems, right? It's not, and a big reason why I do the work that I do today, right, is that as human beings, we have a natural tendency to compare ourselves with other people, right? And when it comes to psychological trauma, when we do that, like for instance saying, man, I've never been through a near-death experience like you, I've never been shot before, what I've been through isn't a big deal, right? When we do things like that, we tend to minimize our own experiences, right? And it's crucial to understand that trauma is not always what it seems. For me, death was the distraction, right? It was the big, obvious, shiny object that everyone kind of pointed to, right? That I automatically believed and started to assume that there should be something wrong with me because of that experience. That this void I was experiencing should be related to what this big, obvious thing was on the surface. When it took me nearly a decade to give myself permission to understand that the near-death experience was the least of it, right? Frankly, going back to what we described at the beginning, with the exception of losing one of my other soldiers that day, that experience was a very positive experience in my life.
Yeah, some of the most
right?
traumatic ones, if one figures out how to transform, are actually the most important ones.
Right.
So that also makes me step back a little bit more from what I said, because maybe the huge bits of suffering are so transformational that they're some of the most meaningful.
And you bring up a really good point, right? It's because it's important to discuss this. What was traumatic for me, right? Far more difficult to navigate was losing my father when I was 7 years old, right? Like the death in someone's life. We all live, we all die, right? And that disruptive experience, that is it can be a form of trauma, right? It was the totality of the deployment to Baghdad. It was divorce. It was living with Crohn's disease, an incurable immune disorder. Far more difficult to go through that, right? Than to get shot. And from my point, right? It was financial distress. It was, the stress of being an entrepreneur. The point is, you don't need to be resurrected from the dead to be in pain, right? And that, kind of the way that we react or respond to a situation in the present moment is based off of our constructs that led up to it, right? Our past constructs. Our past beliefs. And when something disrupts that, fundamentally disrupts that, that's what throws the whole situation into in states that we might not be ready or capable of handling, or feel like we're not capable of handling in the moment. But there again, I come back to the power of human connection, right? Like there's nothing greater perhaps than that perspective that we can gain from one another, So it's interesting, like what you, again, kind of going back to this, there's a power, Brian, going back to this, my professor, does just this amazing work in highlighting some of the fundamental powers of the cosmos, he calls it, right? That are kind of consistencies in the line of physics, right?
Can we transcend it?
Well, I don't know, right? One of those powers is homeostasis, right?
Yeah.
It's like the hawk and the rabbit. There's this beautiful interplay between the two, even though it's a predator-prey kind of relationship, right? That exists within this band that creates, it's amazing when you look at the cosmos. If the cosmos expanded any faster than what it did, it would have expanded too fast and never would have existed. If it expanded any slower, right, it would have imploded and never existed. Right, and it's almost like everything in the cosmos runs this razor's edge that mysteriously produces all of the complexity and beauty and pain and pleasure that we see today. So it's amazing just to reflect on the all of all of it.
I think we got to a really crazy question right there about transcending.
Right.
Yeah, that. Wow. Okay, how about we do a couple thoughts from you before we get to these last couple questions, which maybe give us your thoughts on kind of like what's going on with Darker Souls, kind of like what you're building, what exactly it is. Give us that.
Sure. So, part of what I do, I'm a professional speaker at this point. So I travel around the world. I speak to a range of, practically any organ, Navy SEALs, high school kids, executives, whatever it is. And the purpose of that is to help dislodge and disrupt the way we think about our past experiences, right? Trauma leaves us stuck in the past. So injecting that new perspective, giving people permission maybe reflect on their own lives in a slightly different way, give them the confidence to do that. So that's important, right? That's going to continue. On the backside of that, I also, work with, pretty heavy in the healthcare industry, within the behavioral health community to provide cultural context training to clinical providers to help them better translate the needs of the populations that they're working with. Specifically, right now I'm focusing heavily on law enforcement, first responder, and military folks. But, there's a lot to come. And if you're interested, hop on darkersouls.com. I push out, very short 1-minute videos that are quite disruptive, right? They're, in a very positive way, right? They're designed to spark conversation.
Yes.
Right? And if we can spark conversations around the dinner table, if we can spark these deeper thoughts within our, our friends, our family, our loved ones, our coworkers.
Which should be the first ones to have these great thoughts with.
Right?
Yeah.
Like we talked a lot about shame and guilt tonight, and it's like as devastating as they can be, right? They do have a weakness, right? And that weakness starts with shining light on them. So we bring those things to the forefront and we uncover the root cause. It's not going back in the closet, right? It's not. It can't. So that's where the power of these conversations come from.
Yeah, if we could get to a point where family were the first people that you could go and talk about all of the shame and guilt, and then family could just be with you in your feelings, and be open and have a sense of community, your friends and stuff, without taking advantage of it. So that's gonna be good. I know that happens in a lot of families today, but also the opposite happens, where families aren't safe space, neither as friends. Then what do? Then there's hopelessness. Right. How about The Beauty of a Darker Soul, your book that you authored, released in January of this last year. So the link's in bio. Tell us about the thesis.
Yeah, so The Beauty of a Darker Soul, which we kind of teased out the paradox of that and what we mean by the title. It was written for you, right? It was written as a I could have wrote a book just about the near-death experience and kind of that cool story, but had no desire to really do that, right? I wanted to be able to find a way to leverage that experience to somehow benefit the lives of other people. And, one, it's not designed to be a military book. Obviously, there's some military things in there that are used as a vehicle to get to a larger concept, right? But I will tell you, you're going to see a very different form of what combat today is, a very human side of it that I think your listeners might find very interesting. Certainly, the near-death experience is captured in there and whatnot, but the second half of the book really goes into the paradoxes of what I experienced afterwards. And the biggest advice I'd give if you pick up a copy of this is look at it through your own lens, right? That's how it's designed. And fortunately, that's the feedback we've been getting across the board. Is it's a conversation starter. People are looking at it in their own way, and it's hopefully giving permission. Giving
permission for
right?
it. Yeah, for the vulnerability.
Yeah,
especially for men. Okay, on the way out, let's ask a couple of these questions. We're currently at the Women in Technology International at the summit. We're here supporting brilliant women, and we love it. It's an amazing feeling, especially young women. We're trying to figure out how to equalize opportunity for everybody in the world to have access to achieving their actualization. So why do you find yourself here at the summit? Like, why is it important for you to be here? Give us that.
Well, it was kind of ironic how I ended up here. I just got back from the East Coast, and one of the other presenters was here, so we met up for lunch, and then had the opportunity to interact with some of the attendees, meeting up with a couple of them later. I absolutely support what goes on here, and I think it's very empowering. Again, trauma doesn't discriminate, right? Yeah. And there's so much power in bringing the diversity and the different perspectives to the table, and how they can, the synergy of that, how it can lift up an organization, lift up a culture, right? So I think this is exactly the type of venue that needs to continue, and just really appreciative to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Hard to break stoicism in men.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a reoccurring theme in my life. I've started to find it actually very helpful and beautiful to just, tear up or cry sometimes, be vulnerable, be radically authentic with the way that I'm feeling. And that's been tremendously helpful. And I think the more that we kind of take in a little bit of the feminine energy and feminine spirit with just being okay with those feelings and emotions, and being willing to talk to others and holding space to talk to others about it, and to not be so quick to just shut people down for feeling that way. I think we're going to really combine these energies into like a crazy prosperous world. And I hope we get there. And I hope things like okay, here's a thought. I hope things like artificial general intelligence, that we figure out how to prosper through that timeline. So I guess a question that we typically ask is like, how do we prosper with the advent of all these new exponential technologies and the way they're exacerbating wealth inequality? Where do you think that that's all going?
Man, that's a difficult answer when we're talking about the complexity involved in emotion, the metaphysical aspects that are involved, the reductionist models versus the metaphysical models, right? There's value in all of them. All I would say is it's something to watch very closely in the field of behavioral health, right? And everywhere, right? The thing that I would say is we cannot underestimate the complexity of these deeper emotions, right? And we're probably quite a ways away from being able to tie that to any type of algorithm, right? I will say that from a human standpoint, right, the way I look at this is developing a band of emotional plasticity, right? So that we can operate within the range of emotions that we experience. All of them have their values, right? Like, we think guilt might be bad, but guilt also serves as a correcting mechanism in our lives, right? To learn from. It's an indication that we can improve from, and constructive past. The difference is, when do those emotions become toxic, right? When do they become self-destructive? So here's the thing. If I, when you talked about stoicism, especially in men, right, not being able to recognize or suppress their emotions, why is it important to do that? It's important because if I cannot understand the emotions that I'm experiencing, right, if I can't even access them, then those emotions are in control of me. I'm not in control of it. Right? If I can't understand how or why there are intrusive thoughts racing through my mind, then my mind is in control of me. I'm not in control of it, right? So the idea is that by learning to operate within the spectrum of what we experience and honor all of those experiences, right? That's what gives us real wisdom, real flexibility, over time. So the more we understand ourselves as human beings, the more that's going to translate into the technology side as well.
Yep.
Right? And I frankly, I think, although fortunately we've made a lot of progress in bringing conversations like this to the forefront, just in the last decade, right? Like, and I think the more that continues, the more we learn about ourselves, the more powerful human beings as a whole are going to become. Right?
Yeah. Man. Understanding emotion, otherwise it'll control us. Understanding the feelings, otherwise they'll control us. How about what's the most beautiful thing in the world?
The relationships that we share between one another. You know, and there's varying forms of love. There's varying degrees of connection, right? But if there is, it's interesting for whatever reason. Like there's some synchronicity going on here. Like I have just got back from a wave of talks, a wave of podcasts and interviews, and I repeatedly got the question for some reason, like, is there anything that you fear? And I've never got that question before, And I guess I don't know why people are asking, but it's.
What's your answer?
Well, I was almost stumped because it was a really complex thing to answer for some reason. Well, one, I would say that I'd be concerned if I didn't fear anything, right? But the question is, what do I fear? Like, how do I give a clear answer to that? The only thing that I would say, the primary thing that would sadden me to lose, or the thing that I would think about, right, is like in a moment of death, for example, will be the loss of love, right? What happens to the relationships that we have with our significant others, right? And it's interesting because I reached a point where I literally have to remind myself of what I experienced in that moment of death to kind of reflect on that and work through it myself, right? Because I have to remember in that final moment, in the most beautiful, indescribable way, all of that falls away, and it truly feels like we're part of everything and nothing, right? That as hard as this is to conceptualize and understand, it's almost like anything that we can think of or experience right now almost doesn't matter, right? Those fears become almost irrelevant in that final moment, right? And as if it's taken away, satisfied, fulfilled, all at the same time, And I think I guess maybe in the end that's what faith is, in some respects, right? Is being able to kind of have comfort in believing that that's there, right?
The relationships between us are the most beautiful thing, and then the love being taken away is fear. Is fearful. Fear of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think we're alone in the cosmos?
I doubt that. I mean, it's certainly it's possible, but it's to me it's almost impossible that there isn't some other life forms out there. I mean, with just a massive scale of the universe, the cosmos, that continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger the more we understand about it. I think it'd be it's hard for me to believe that there's nothing else out there, or no one, or no thing, right?
Do you think we're in a simulation?
It's not possible to negate it, right? But therein it kind of begs the question: who's running a simulation, right? So it's a possibility. I think that's a really interesting theory of consciousness, and
exactly.
I really do.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's the reason why the show's name is simulation.
Right on.
It's a very interesting theory of consciousness. It's a very interesting mind-expanding thought experiment.
Yep.
Toy around with the variables. Think about it a little bit more.
Right.
Teach the kids about it. See what they have to say. Yeah. Give them that fundamental understanding of how we got here, and also of where are we going.
Right.
And who the fuck are we?
Right.
Yeah.
It's wild. I think we have a responsibility to think through all of these theories, right? And because I mean, the simulation theory, it's obviously very powerful, right? So there's a lot out there. I mean, I guess in the end, right? It's we're all riding it. We're in this journey, right? We're in this process. We're experiencing it together, and there's really so much to still uncover.
Yes.
And if anyone thinks life's a dead end, I mean, there's creativity all around us, right?
Yeah. Actually, you had that quote. It was creativity is the inverse of trauma.
Yeah, that might be a good. I really do. I believe trauma leaves us trapped in our past constructs, right? That is like kind of a core definition of trauma. We respond in the present moment based on our experiences in the past, and it prevents us from kind of moving on. So what's the inverse of that? Creativity. Creativity can dislodge us from the past. Innovation can dislodge us from the past, right?
And this isn't just creativity or innovation in things that you build into the world. This is also creativity and innovation within. Like growth mindset,
Yep.
Being able to be with those feelings and that vulnerability. And those are kind of the same kind of creativity, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Expanding your own mind, right? Developing yourself, music, creating music. There are so many different ways that, we can experience the world, right? And acquire new perspectives. It's just sometimes we need a nudge from other people to do it, because that past trap of trauma can be just very consuming,
tight,
right?
Very tight. And if the grip gets too tight, then hopelessness, then suicide. So we better do a damn good job at helping out, build a stronger social fabric. And,
there's a philosopher named Tim Morton out of the UK. And he actually describes trauma as people being caught in a state of executing past algorithms.
Yeah,
Right?
that's very interesting.
And if you think about it, if we're just droning through life, if we're executing the algorithm, right? Where is the innovation? Right? Where is the creativity?
Will the algorithm stay in the past?
Right.
Or will it get directed towards the future?
Precisely. So it's an interesting. He's an interesting guy.
Every moment of thought is a choice in a direction.
Right.
But sometimes it's important to go into the direction of the trauma, to be with it and fully give it the full feeling of being there with those feelings and being okay with them, and being vulnerable with talking about them, and then where is the point? When is the point that it's actually appropriate, once you've been there, to go forward and to look back with a smile? Figuring that out, and how it ends up being figured out, has still yet to be discovered and uncovered. It's different for every person, but I think people like you are helping us understand that process. And we thank you.
Well, thank you.
We thank you for it so much, Josh. Thank you for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here with us and teaching
It was a fun conversation.
You had a good time?
Oh yeah,
Awesome.
This is great.
Awesome. We learned so much talking to you, and we'll have some links in the bio to Darker Souls, as well as the book, Beauty of a Darker Soul. And holy cow, unpacking so much about trauma and transformation. I mean, this was great. This is definitely a very solid conversation. I'm super excited to publish it. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We greatly appreciate it. If you guys had a good time, share the content with other people. Get talking about trauma and transformation. Get talking about building a stronger social fabric, giving that space for people, the beauty of a darker soul. And then also do give us a subscribe, comment below. We'd love to feature your thoughts on social. Give us a video, go and create with this content. Don't just consume, go and make something with it after you watch it, write about it, read about it, make a video about it, go and start a company with it, maybe go and speak about it to other people, get them more willing to be vulnerable. And join us on Patreon. We need to continue doing cool things like bringing our set out here to Women in Technology International and continuing to provide you with this great content. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk to you again soon. Peace.